Throughout United States history, education has stood at the forefront of policy and reform. As administrations come and go, education has been subjected to all kinds of governmental authority at the federal, state, and local levels. There are times when these entities do not see the greater need of their constituents and miss the mark, resulting in the need for the community and other stakeholders to make a stand and lobby for change. This was true in the 1997 Alaskan case of Kasayulie versus State, in which parents Willie and Sophie Kasayulie, along with other families of rural western Alaska, sued the state due to inadequate funding of rural schools. The lawsuit stated that the state's method of funding school construction projects discriminated against rural students, as it allowed urban schools to use a debt reimbursement program that was not accessible to rural schools due to rural schools lacking a tax base. The Superior Court ultimately ruled that the state acted unconstitutionally, violating the Education Clause, the Equal Protection Clause of the Alaskan Constitution, and federal civil rights laws. Although this case originated and impacted the Alaskan people the most, it has greater implications for educational reforms and considerations for all levels of government and education.
The history of the case. The Kasayulie versus State lawsuit details the inequitable efforts regarding school construction and financing of those projects. In the early 1990s, Alaska developed a program to fund construction projects in schools across the state. The intent of the Capital Improvement Program, CIP, was to fund construction projects statewide, but legislative officials failed to allocate the funds appropriately. The funds were unconstitutionally dispersed to urban legislators. Equity was a major concern of many citizens in Alaska as students from rural areas were being discriminated against. Education Law Center 2020. Rural schools were largely neglected, and school sites were deemed unsafe for students and failed to create a positive learning environment. The majority population of students attending rural schools are Alaskan Natives. Citizens residing in the rural communities felt as if the funding was racially discriminatory against Alaskan Natives. Willie Kasayulie is a member of the Alaskan Federation of Natives Board who has great pride in his community and his children's education. A father of 5, his goal was to ensure the best learning experience possible, as well as adequate resources for all students. Hopkins 2016. After numerous attempts for new classrooms and facility updates, the Kasayulie versus State lawsuit was filed in 1997. The Alaska Department of Education and Early Education 2020. The case continued through 2011 before a settlement was reached. Kasayulie is regarded as a major advocate for Alaskan Natives and all students residing in rural regions. His efforts, along with many other community members, paved the way for justice and equity regarding construction funding.
The two sides of the case. The plaintiffs are referred to as Kasayulie after Willie Kasayulie, who was the first named plaintiff of the group. The lawsuit itself was filed by the group Citizens for the Educational Advancement of Alaska's Children, a rural superintendent's advocacy group, and it was filed as a unified class action lawsuit against the state of Alaska. The 12 plaintiffs were parents and rural district superintendents, all from western or southern Alaska. Their primary argument was that Alaska was violating its constitutional responsibility to provide equitable access to education, specifically to rural students who are primarily Alaskan Native. This led the plaintiffs to argue that current educational funding practices were not only unequal, but also racially discriminatory. The argument itself was framed around Article 7, Section 1 of the Alaskan State Constitution, which essentially guarantees equity of education. The plaintiffs argued that budget cuts to education inherently impacted rural and native populations disproportionately, as they had little access to any increased state funding because of a lack of taxable population base, lack of taxable land, and inconsistent and disjointed governance systems that would allow for them to create bonds or levies. Not only were urban schools able to use their systems of governance to essentially make up for lack of funding, previous legislation made bonds an incredibly effective way to make up for the lack of funding, as the state would repay as much as 70% of bond values to holders. Evidence to support this argument was direct comparison between urban and rural schools and the shape that they were in. While the state argued that the system was not inherently discriminatory or racist, the consistent rulings in favor of the plaintiffs led to an incredibly long process of settlement in which the state began working with the plaintiffs to directly address the most necessary construction issues. This shows that the state likely understood that inequity was occurring in the school system, but an out-and-out loss in court could have been devastating.
The final court decision. The state of Alaska provides additional funding to school districts for school facility improvements. This includes the maintaining and building of new schools. School districts are required to raise partial funds for school improvement needs. In turn, the state reimburses school districts and provides the additional funds needed for facility improvement needs. The court found that rural school districts were not able to generate funds to build and maintain school facilities. Rural school districts have difficulty generating money from local property taxes because of the lack of properties. This led to urban school districts being unfairly favored through school facility funding and left rural school districts underfunded for school projects due to the lack of tax base. The court case made the state of Alaska redistribute funds to help alleviate the financial burden of rural school districts. Alaska's rural school districts cannot generate the needed funding to maintain and build school facilities. This court case made it possible for rural school districts to raise and receive the funds needed for school improvements.
The long-term effects that will take place because of the Kasayulie versus state settlement could essentially help school districts and rural communities all throughout the United States. This settlement ensures that schools in rural communities will have the facilities needed to give students the same education that students in urban areas are most likely to get. Agahavni states the research comes to show that rural students fall behind their urban counterparts. Agahavni also goes on to talk about how policymakers are working hard to ensure equal development to rural places, which tend to fall behind financially due to the lack of taxpayer income in these areas. Seeing that there is a great significance between rural and urban schools, this lawsuit can change the outcome in many rural areas across the nation.